Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Press Freedom Forum of the Association and Club of the Foreign Press Correspondents here at the World Trade Center in New York as we celebrate Press Freedom Day. I'm Susan Tehrani. I'm an international correspondent with WION News India, Euronews. I'm also a UN diplomatic correspondent and vice president of the Association and Club of Foreign Press Correspondents in the United States. But most of all, I'm very excited that we finally had the opportunity to gather in person after so long, and I'm able to see so many of my lovely colleagues, foreign correspondents, and also new faces as well. So thank you so much to all of you who decided to come and join us in person. And also we are joined by our friends online as well, virtually through Facebook, Twitter, Instagram as well. A warm welcome to those friends as well. And also a special thanks to our supporters and those who have supported our mission throughout the years, not only supporting the foreign correspondence community and advocating their work, but also press freedom around the world. Today, we are proud to present our honorary awardee for lifetime contribution to press freedom and excellence in journalism. And for our friends who are watching and joining us online, please visit our website at foreigncorrespondents.org and subscribe to our newsletter. You can also visit our special media platform, foreignpress.org. And to start us off, I would like to invite our chairwoman of the Association and Club of Foreign Correspondents, Nancy Prager-Kemmel.
Greetings to you all. The Association of Foreign Press Correspondents and the AFPC Club want to voice our profound appreciation to Silverman Property and Darren McQuinlan for providing us the opportunity to be here at 7 World Trade Center. Silverman Property and Darren McQuinlan, thank you for the important support that you offer to the foreign press correspondence community. Before I begin my short statement concerning the importance of Foreign Press Freedom Day, I want to express my gratitude to all of our members and associates, as well as to our stellar supporters and partners, including the Knight Foundation, General Motors, Bayer, Procter & Gamble, Toyota, Microsoft, Volkswagen, Libra Group, ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, the Hinrich Foundation, and to our own Mitzi Perdue. Our voice would not resonate without all of your participation and commitment. In this perilous time, the words freedom of the press are no longer an absolute. They have become malleable at best and an oxymoron at worst. We're in an epistemological crisis. Yes, freedom of the press, it's no longer an absolute. They've become malleable at best, as I said, because we have good and bad. We do not have fiction and nonfiction. These are indiscernible. Thus, never has the conversation been more urgent. Never has this conversation been so dire. With turmoil erupting in every corner of the earth, the blurred lines between right and wrong, good and bad, just and unjust have become completely subjective. World Press Freedom Day, designated as, quote, the International Day to End Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists, end quote. It has declared its position widely shared worldwide that the crime of violence perpetrated on journalists is recognized not only as a single crime, but exponentially as a crime that reverberates across the rules of social norms and acceptable standards. It is a crime against each and every one of us. By controlling the messenger, you control the information, both in access and in credibility. Likewise, by eliminating the messenger, you eliminate, not illuminate, the world. We, the Association of Foreign Press Correspondents, deem this unacceptable and ask, who are the obvious vulnerable victims but the voice of the truth tellers, those singular flames in a vast darkness without bias nor prejudice, those lone voices that are committed and reporting the unadulterated facts as they have been encountered and revealed. However, we acknowledge as well that the damage is exponential and that the victims are all of us, struggling to assess the truth, allowing us to be prepared to deal with its consequences. We are called, no, compelled, to use our voices, our influence as fellow journalists to hold responsible those that threaten the very truth and democratic norms. We join the vast audience calling for laws and standards to be upheld and journalists legally protected. We implore all governments to hold accountable those who target journalists with harassment, intimidation, and violence. We denounce impunity anytime, anywhere. Thank you.
I would like to now invite one of our organization's valuable partners and supporters, Executive Director of Communication at General Motors International, Mr. George Svigos. George leads a team of communication professionals across South America, Europe, Russia, Central Asia, Middle East, North Africa, India, Southeast Asia, Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. His objective is to develop and implement communication strategies in support of GM's vision of creating a world of zero crashes, zero emissions, and zero congestion. George?
Thanks very much, Susan. I think you took most of my key messages, actually, so the speech might be a little repetitive. Welcome everyone who's joining us here in the room and virtually. It really is a pleasure and an honour for me to be representing General Motors here today. I would like to thank the association for the work they're doing, and particularly taking this moment to gather people today to be celebrating press freedom. I think that, as we've all seen in the events over recent weeks and months in particular, this idea, this flame of press freedom has never been more important. As the saying goes, the first casualty in war is truth, and people in this room and your colleagues around the world play such a critical role in ensuring that the truth actually does get out there. I do want to encourage everyone, obviously, in this room. I humbly encourage everyone to keep inspiring those people that look to you for that leadership. You're all obviously leaders in your field here, and there'll be many, many people looking to you to set that example. I'd like to thank Nancy Prager-Camel and Thanos Donatis for our partnership. We're new to the association. We think it's a hugely valuable partnership for us, particularly in a business that I'm associated with. As you've heard, 60 markets. My mum, who's of Greek origin, likes to joke that I'm trying to be not Alexander the Great, but George the OK, with my empire stretching over 10 time zones and 40 languages. I'm getting there. But obviously hugely important for us. It's becoming more and more important for us, not just as a business, but in our mission to create a world of, as you said, zero crashes, zero emissions, and zero congestion. And we're serious about this. I was talking just with a few people in the room before that we now are in this wonderful position where the thing that we do, the purpose that we exist for, which is to make products that move and connect people, is actually something that can help make the world better and make communities better. And the advent of electric vehicles and what it will do over the next 10 to 20 years across the world is a positive. One that I hope you all hold us to account for as well, but one where I think advocacy that you bring to the table will be so important. Because as we develop these new mobility solutions, there's going to be a whole raft of things we can do for underserved, underprivileged sectors of the community, where we can move and connect people even better than we can today. I do want to close by, again, thanking you for the opportunity to speak and the opportunity to represent GM here. I wish everyone a successful evening and a successful event, and I'll hand over to the next speaker. Thank you very much.
I'd like to now invite our executive director, who has been so instrumental in bringing the Association of Foreign Press Correspondents to the path of its current success, the star, Tanos
Hello, Susan. Are you going to have it, please?
Yes, of course.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here with us today. I want to thank, first of all, our board members and, of course, our chairwoman, Nancy Prager-Campbell, for all the leadership she provides. And she has been a great advocate of keeping our important work that we are doing every day. And despite the difficulties, despite the ups and downs, and despite sometimes the rejection, sometimes the positive outcomes, I think it is important what we do and that we keep fighting for what it is our cause. Nancy Prager-Campbell already thanked, of course, our supporters, George Sfigos, our good friend Ray Kerins, Richard Gingras, Zere Van Dijk, and so many other partners and supporters who are watching us online. I want to thank you, everyone, and also the Silverstein Properties for hosting us here today at the 7 World Trade Center in New York. The concept, I would say, of press freedom today is, and it's important, cannot be summarized, of course, in a few words. There is a discussion about the necessity of respecting the role of journalists in reporting objectively the developments around the world and providing the historical record of truth. During World Press Freedom Day every year, we hear messages, speeches, presentations that are made addressing the significance of the role of journalists in general and how successful democratic societies depend on the independence and the freedom of journalists. I, however, believe that there is one more important and urgent matter that we need as a society to address, and it is required to address it immediately in terms of the freedom of the press. The issue is the uncontrolled dissemination of misinformation and false news that feeds our society with, as we all know, polarization, division, confusion on a daily basis. At the same time, people have also changed the way they are reading the news, seeking out information that is given in a manner that is almost telegraphical, as we all know, without actually reading most of the times, but by waiting to receive the news in just a few words through a video of a few seconds. This, to my personal opinion, has caused people as consumers of news to become impatient with critical thinking about what they read, unable to stop the influx of misinformation into our lives, and unable to distinguish whether something is true or not. Although we make calls every year seeking respect for press freedom, I'm afraid that these calls have little effect. And this is where we have failed as journalists. I'm concerned that journalists primarily interact with each other rather than with our society. In my opinion, journalists are trapped in a microcosm where they seek, as we all see, recognition, freedom, and respect through a dialogue that occurs exclusively between themselves, between ourselves, but not with the society. Sadly, we approach society and interpret what society expects of us as journalists in terms of an era when people purchased their newspapers from news stands, and when news were about what was happening in the outside world was exclusively provided by journalists, which is not the case anymore. In my view, journalists and journalism unfortunately tend to go out of fashion, and the question is how to make journalism fashionable again. We can achieve this by two means, to my personal opinion. First, we must invest in supporting the journalism and the journalists that serve the local communities. And the work being done by, for example, the Knight Foundation and also the Google News is vital to this end. At the same time, we must also reinvent journalism on the one hand by fostering new generations of journalists who do not view journalism as a typical job, but as a creative endeavor. Journalism, to my opinion, is more of an art than a profession, and journalists must think of themselves as artists who produce art. In order to succeed, these artists must know how to market their work. Therefore, journalists need to be trained in how to transform the art of journalism into a source of income for their work by capitalizing the opportunities technology is offering. For instance, how ready is journalism to embrace artificial intelligence? What level of readiness do the present and future generations of journalists possess to confront the proliferation of new forms of fake news, such as deepfakes? As journalists, how do we make journalism, our profession, a necessity for consumers again, and how we make journalism a product that meets consumer needs rather than our needs as journalists? Freedom of press does not only mean protecting journalists from the danger, censorship, and vindictive treatment by authoritarian regimes. The biggest threat, to my view, is that the press freedom today is facing comes from journalists themselves, who are unable to convince the world that their role and work evolve at the same rate as our society evolves. With these thoughts, I would like to welcome back Susan Modares-Tehrani, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you for that. Now it's time to present our first honorary awardee, and that's to Jerry Van Dyke. Jerry Van Dyke, yes, you could please come here. I'm going to read a brief bio. Thank you so much. You could sit down, but I would love to read your bio first. Yes, please have a seat. Because it's such a rich bio. Jerry Van Dyke, thank you so much for joining us in person. Jerry is a journalist and author, although he needs no introduction to so many of us. His work has focused, much of his writing has focused on faraway, mostly dangerous places, particularly Afghanistan and Pakistan. In the early 1980s, as a correspondent for the New York Times, he lived with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan as they fought against the Soviet Red Army, an experience that was recapped in his Pulitzer Prize-nominated articles. After 9/11, he returned to Afghanistan to report for CBS News. Later, he became the only journalist to go up into the mountains near the Pakistani border to the site where Pat Tillman, U.S. Army Ranger and former Arizona Cardinals football star, was killed in 2004. In late 2007, on a contract with Times Books, he hiked into the tribal areas of Pakistan, off limits to foreigners, considered a blank space on the map, the headquarters of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. In 2008, he was captured by the Taliban and taken up into the mountains and held for 45 days. The harrowing experience is detailed in his book Captive, My Time as a Prisoner of the Taliban. He has traveled through the Greater Middle East and South Asia, and he is the only journalist to meet with the leadership of the Haqqani Network since before 9/11, after which he wrote The Trade, My Journey into the Labyrinth of Political Kidnapping, which was published in October 2017. He has also worked with the Obama White House. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to introduce to you Jerry Van Dyke and to present you, Jerry, with our honorary award. Thank you.
thought I was going to be the last speaker. I'm the first speaker. I'll put it in 1992, National Geographic magazine sent me on an assignment, one that everybody in this room I'm sure would accept also, to travel the length of the Amazon River and to go find its source. As I traveled upstream, after about 3 months, as we began to work our way up into the foothills of the Andes, we stopped one day at a Catholic mission. And I asked the priest, who was from Spain, the name of the tribe where we were. And he gave me the name. And then he said to me, "You too belong to a tribe, the tribe of journalists." And I thought back to a time when an elderly man said to me, "Oh, you're a journalist. To be a journalist is like joining the priesthood. You take a vow of poverty." And I'm sure some of you agree with me on that. The oldest punishment in the world is to be banished from your tribe. It is very easy to talk about speaking truth to power. It's very easy to be seduced by the glamour of television, to be seduced by all the awards that could come your way, all of the power that comes from being a journalist, if you work for a big newspaper. But as the deputy foreign editor of the Times said to me when I came back from Afghanistan in 1982 over lunch, he said, "You write ultimately for yourself. You don't write for the person," and this is very hard for all of us, you don't write or produce, if you work in television, for those who sign your paycheck. My mentor at the paper was a fellow named Mike Kaufman, who said, "I don't work for the US government, I work for the truth." And it was, as was brought out very, very, very well already today. There's a saying here, it goes, an old saying, a businessman, woman, seeks profits. A politician seeks power. An artist, and here we'll insert journalist, seeks the truth. It is a calling. Not exactly the priesthood, but it is very definitely a calling. Today, journalism is flourishing in America. But there's also a very strong streak of fascism in America. And it is causing tremendous damage to our culture. It's not just here, it also exists to a degree in Europe, elsewhere, from Afghanistan, Pakistan, Egypt, China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, places where I've worked. There's no such thing as a free press. We have to be definitely on guard constantly about the freedom of the press. But I would also say, and most importantly, and what I have learned, and I think I learned this most vividly when I was captive by the Taliban. I said, if I survive, if I get out of here, all I care about is being with the woman I love and writing what I want to write. It came to me. We've just seen, for those of you who follow these things, I know practically everyone in this room, maybe all of you have been following, the trial of those who killed brutally Jim Foley, Stephen Sotloff, and other English and American aid workers. What struck me most as I looked at Jim Foley and Stephen Sotloff on television was how they kept their backs straight and their head up during that entire time. I was in a similar situation. Of course, they put the knife back. It was their image, their courage, and how they died with dignity that stood out for me more than anything else. They were the true people of courage. Because the most important part of freedom, press freedom, is that which is within you. It's the ability to stand up for what you think is right, the ability to say what you know is the truth, the ability to speak truth to power, which is a cliche, but also most importantly to those who sign your paycheck. I'm very, very grateful to be here today. I'm very happy. I'm very pleased to be here. But I also know, and I feel it's part of my job to say that something that Thomas Jefferson once said, if the press is free and the people can read, all is well. Trouble is, all is not well, is it? We're under tremendous, tremendous pressure throughout the land. And those of you who are foreign correspondents, I know, and I certainly hope you do, travel throughout the land, from Indian reservations to salmon fishermen up in Alaska, to find out the truth of America. Because we do have to worry about this very dangerous thing called fascism here, which is a word we don't like to use, but we should use it. Ultimately, I go back to the most important thing, and I'll leave that with you now, because is that do not forget, every one of you, as I had to learn very brutally, something that I was told when I was much younger. And Craig Whitney, the deputy foreign editor at the time, said, "You write for yourself." I had to learn that really come to me in prison. So I pass that on to you now. Real press freedom lies within each one of you and me. Thank you so much for this award.
Thank you so much, Jerry, for those comments and for joining us and for those inspiring words. Our second awardee is Zahra Joya. Zahra was born in Bamyan province in 1992. She was 5 years old when the Taliban seized power in Afghanistan. From 1996 to 2001, they banned almost all education for girls, the Taliban. Joya would dress as a boy to go to school. She is the first girl from their small village who went to university. She studied law. She started being a journalist in 2011 for the local media outlet, and in 2020 she decided to create a newsroom named after a woman who was stoned to death by the Taliban in 2015 in Ghor province. The name of her newsroom is Rokhshana. In June 2021, Rokhshana Media started a partnership with The Guardian and published some painful stories about Afghan women, until the Taliban came back to power in Afghanistan. She remained in Afghanistan. In August 2021, she was forced to flee the country. Now Rokhshana Media is a platform for women and tries to amplify the voice of those who lost their rights because of Taliban law. Zahra Joya has been named one of Time's Women of the Year for 2022 for her reporting of women's lives in Afghanistan, and she is the honorary Foreign Press Awardee for the Association of Foreign Press Correspondents. Zahra would be with us today, but due to her visa processing delays, she could not travel to the US to receive this award. Instead, she is joining us from London. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me to welcome Zahra Joya.
Hello, Susan, thank you for the kind introductions. Greetings from London. I'm truly honored to be part of the Press Freedom Forum event, which takes place today at the World Trade Center in New York by the Association of Foreign Press Correspondents in the United States. I'm also truly honored to be receiving the Prestige Foreign Press Award in recognition of our work and the public service we do to protect and advance press freedom, raise awareness, and mobilize the public opinion in our world. I also want to congratulate my colleagues Gervana Dyke and Mr. Richard Gengras, the Vice President of News from Google, who are also the awardees. I also want to particularly thank Mr. Gengras and all partners and supporters of the Association of Foreign Press Correspondents in the United States for all the important support the private for the AFPC-USA to continue its significant work and serve the community of foreign journalists. This award comes at the time that press freedom in my country is under attack. More than 500 media outlets stopped operating during since Taliban took power 8 months ago. Hundreds of journalists, male and female, lost their jobs. Hundreds of media workers, including myself, fled Afghanistan. Today, my colleague at Rukhsana, as well as my journalist friends at other outlets in Afghanistan, are working in extremely difficult situations. Women journalists are particularly at risk. They are disappearing from the Afghan media landscape simply because they are women. I started Rukhsana Media in 2020. At that time, we had a small and simple goal. We wanted to create conversation among Afghan women about their lives and dreams. I was saying to Afghan women, this is your space, a place where we will tell your stories and the stories of all our sisters across Afghanistan. I never imagined then that I would be running Rukhsana in Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. We at Rukhsana Media tell the story of diet, love, success, and failure of Afghan women from across the country every day. At Rukhsana Media, we tell the stories of women and girls who are living under a regime of gender apartheid in 21st century, at a time when women cannot even choose their own clothes. At Rukhsana Media, we want to tell what it means to lose not only your rights, your job, but also your social identity. We do not do simple journalism these days. We are also covering the loss of our own rights, of our own freedoms, but it is really painful. One day, we write about girls being deprived of going to school, compulsory hijab. The next day, about forced marriage, mysterious killings, but the list goes on. On August 15, we not only lost our 20-year role in government, but we lost the result of our 20 years of our lives. This is never easy. Unfortunately now, half of population of Afghanistan, women, are being victimized by the Taliban barbaric violence. Taliban's role has reduced the value of women's life to their bodies and sexual organs. The group has imposed strict restriction on women's personal and social life. I am speaking to you here as a woman journalist. Although it has never been easy to be a woman and be a journalist in Afghanistan, it is now much more difficult to be even an ordinary woman in my country. Being a journalist is a far-reaching wish. There are very few female journalists remaining in the country. Taliban have forced them to wear hijab, well banned them from appearing on film and raising their voice on radios in some provinces. In our small newsroom at Roshana Media, we usually listen to the women who are telling their horrible stories while crying. When they talked about their lost dreams, they burst into tears. These women start their struggle for their rights and social status from their own home and try to expand into schools, university, and the wider society. But all of that vanished overnight when the Taliban came back. Afghan women have voiced their concern in the world. They have repeatedly questioned the world's silence about the Taliban's crimes against women. At the end of my speech, I would like to say that free media in Afghanistan is in serious danger. Without a free media, Afghanistan would be a country like North Korea. Please don't forget Afghanistan and support free media in my country. Thank you for recognizing us.
Our final award for this afternoon goes to our special guest, Richard Gingras. He is the Vice President of News at Google, and in this role, he focuses on how Google surfaces news on Google's consumer services and how Google can enable a diverse press on the open web. He also guides Google's efforts to enable a healthy, open ecosystem for quality journalism. This includes the Google News Initiative, Google's global investment in efforts to elevate quality journalism, explore new models for sustainability, and provide technology to stimulate cost efficiency in newsroom. Richard has walked the bleeding edge from satellite networks to search engines, from Apple to Excite to Google. He readily concedes he's made more mistakes than you. Richard has been involved in digital media since 1980, or as he once put it, since the days of steam-powered modems. He's also helped found Salon.com, where he once worked with Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Glenn Greenwald. He also serves on the board of the First Amendment Coalition, the International Center for Journalists, and the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, and UC Berkeley School of Journalism. Richard, it is my honor to present you with our honorary award of the Association of Foreign Press Correspondents. Thank you so much for joining us in person. I think Nancy has your award. Oh.
My wife's a photographer. You long learn where to make sure to look at the cameras when they're out trying to do their jobs. I thank you enormously to the Association for Foreign Press Correspondents. I thank the board. I thank Nancy. I thank Thanos for those very thoughtful remarks earlier. And I thank you as well for the opportunity to delve a little bit deeper into the challenges facing journalism in our age. And they are indeed, I think, enormously complex challenges. And I'm not going to suggest I know the answers. But I do think, and I have learned over the years, that if you don't know the answers, at least start focusing on what the right questions are. So thank you. My appreciation, I must say, is only exceeded by my deep discomfort in comparison to Jerry Van Dyke and Zara Joya. They knowingly put themselves at great risk, and still they took the next step forward. That's courage. Jerry returned to Afghanistan again and again until the Taliban held him for 45 days. Zara battled to create freedom of the press where there was none, and now she can't return home. They put their lives at risk. I have not. They inspire me. I thank you for that deeply. But we do pursue a common objective. We strive to protect the role of journalism in our modern world. In honoring Jerry Van Dyke and Zara Joya or Maria Ressa or Dmitry Muratov, we must also recognize the battle for the role of journalism is ever more complex and challenging. We need more self-reflection on how journalism works in our digital age, and we need to look more closely at the emergence of public policy around the world. In 1974, I worked at the Public Broadcasting Service in Washington. We were building the first satellite network to deliver television programs to stations across the United States. Until then, distributing programs to stations was costly and cumbersome. Telephone lines were usually expensive. Tapes were often shipped serially from station to station. Satellites changed the face of television. It enabled dozens of new programming networks. It laid the foundation for the explosion of cable television. The number of channels in the United States multiplied from 5 to 500 within a decade. I remember I was in the room when Ted Turner introduced the first all-news channel, CNN. His objective was to deepen news coverage, expand beyond the 2-minute stories. Since then, Turner's vision for dedicated news channels has devolved from thoughtful coverage to inexpensive and more combative opinion programming. At the beginning, there were channels for a wide array of special audiences. Today, the programming is reality shows and shark attacks, all owned by a handful of large media companies. What's my point? The fight for share of voice will happen no matter the means of distribution. Those with real or perceived influence, be they governments or the private sector, will give no quarter to maintain and expand their share of voice, their share of influence. Understandably, but know this. The internet expanded access to distribution. It lowered the bar. It eliminated the friction for any voice seeking an audience. It made what Zara does possible. The audience might have to find you, but you can be found. Word can be spread. New audiences can meet new voices. Ask Maria Ressa. It was the dream of free expression purists. At the dawning of the internet, many, including me, were optimistic. We believed that the more free expression, the better. We believe our better angels will win. I still believe that, but we learned there was a dark side. We're not all angels. The internet enabled challenging and problematic behaviors. Understandably, governments are starting to regulate the internet, typically with good intentions, but often with unintended consequences that potentially damage the free press and the openness of the internet. Which leads to the fundamental question we face. How can we assure that evolving internet policy will enable an open and diverse press and not reinforce a specific political interest or prop up a legacy industry? I fear the open internet is slipping away from us. That our 25 internet years enabling the penultimate model of free expression was an aberration. The challenge of problematic expression cannot be ignored. However, it's essential we understand and balance the risks to free expression itself. The slope is slippery. Some participants in the policy discussion see the internet as a threat to their share of voice, their share of influence. They'd rather turn the internet into a distribution environment like those that enabled their earlier success, where share of voice went to those with power and influence to command distribution. They would rather see more friction between new voices and the audiences they seek. They would prefer to see core concepts of free linking and fair use curtailed. They may campaign with noble words, but the bottom line is a desire to maintain prior dominance, to constrain the openness of the web, to reduce the diversity of voices it enables. I urge close attention. I urge journalists reporting on internet policy to dig beyond the memes, to not be blinded by short-term self-interest. The stakes are high for the future of journalism, for the future of open societies. I support thoughtful internet regulation, as do my colleagues at Google. I only hope that it respects these key principles. Protect the open web and the open internet and the free expression it enables, and not a closed distribution system favored by a few, favoring the few. Enable a diverse free press, and protect against undue government influence that imbalances the news ecosystem. We typically trust regulation to have the intended effect, but analyze the fine print. Will legislation that purports to address misinformation be effective while creating wide exceptions for politicians or any spin master calling themselves a journalist? Will legislation proposed by legacy interests seeking a return to their era of dominance constrain the open web and the opportunity for a more diverse free press? The world has changed. More than ever, societies need quality journalism to understand their world and express their role as citizens. The internet overwhelms us. It continues to change click by click with every glob of media it spits out. From the sweet memes of social networks to an endless array of opinionators and influencers. From the helpful tutorials and inspired dreams of video creators to hucksters and propagandists. From snapshots of cute grandkids to doctored photos of false righteous indignation. From thoughtful forays into innovative digital journalism to astroturf journalism funded by who knows who. It's a complicated media ecosystem composed of frightening simplicity, our culture, politics, in news reduced to memes and 280-character sound bites lacking context and substance. Our world is twisted and torqued by daunting cultural memes where induced to amplify, by bad ads offering false remedies, by politicians igniting the fears he or she pledges to extinguish. Yes, there is thoughtful, fact-based journalism sprinkled in, hard to identify and largely overwhelmed by the cacophonous, mind-numbing cicada buzz that is the collective expression of the internet. How does journalism perform its critical role in the midst of all that? How might we better understand how journalism is perceived by the societies we serve? Do our audiences understand the role of journalism? Do they know which sources to trust with their precious time and money? Is the explosion of inexpensive but popular opinion smothering the credibility of fact-based coverage? Is the drift towards partisan news making the problem worse? Do they understand what we think they understand? News sites seek subscriptions and memberships making earnest pledges about the virtues of quality journalism. What small percentage of our societies understands any of that? Yes, we can demand more literacy, more media literacy, but telling us 20 reasons we should eat more broccoli and less pizza is not enough. We need to explore new recipes for an enticing and healthy journalistic menu. How might news organizations better understand the needs of their communities? I ask publishers what research they do. Typically the answer is not much or none, or it's we study our logs, we analyze our traffic. Okay, but that says nothing about those who don't visit. It says nothing about what the audience values. One friend, a managing editor, dear friend, told me, I understand what my readers want. Now, I wasn't about to pass judgment on my friend's wisdom, but I did ask, don't you expect your reporters to ask many questions before deciding what they know or don't know about an issue? So why not do the research? What information do communities need on a daily basis? What will build ties with the community? What will they value? What will they pay for? Do they respect your work? Do they understand your work? I work with emerging local news outlets around the world. There's reason for hope. Cityside, a nonprofit in California, Village Media, a for-profit in Canada, City News, a for-profit in Italy, have found sustainable success. They engage with their communities and understand their information needs. Their success is an opportunity that many local news entrepreneurs can benefit from. Accountability journalism is critical to the role of journalism. But it's important to address the community's broad information needs. Community events, local sports, obituaries still matter. It's this service journalism that drives engagement, builds community ties, enables local advertising, and expands the audience for the accountability journalism that you do provide. As David Walmsley of Canada's Globe and Mail said, might we underpin the high church work with respect for all of a community's information needs. How can journalism rebuild trust? 8 years ago, I joined Sally Lehrman to call for a focus on the declining trust in journalism. With the Trust Project, Sally has generated research and assembled principles and playbooks for news organizations on approaches to transparency and trust. The Trust Project works with hundreds of news organizations around the world, but as Sally would admit, there's more to learn, there's more to do. Ulrich Hagerup and the Constructive Journalism Institute in Denmark, which we support, pursues a different angle, rethinking the models, the formats, the linguistics we use in our journalistic work. The word constructive is key. It's not news that makes you feel good. Constructive journalism goes beyond the typical coverage model, with clear signals and clear intent to include the necessary context, the hows and the whys, and importantly, a consideration of how a calamitous event could be prevented. It's not about telling our audiences what to think, it's helping them understand how to think. It's designed to seek common ground. When staging debates, they avoid divisive labels like crossfire. What better way to gain society's respect than by demonstrating the power of journalism to help a community understand its challenges and address them? But how does a society understand its challenges? How can journalism avoid amplifying a society's distorted sense of risk? In the United States, we are 400 times more likely to die in a traffic accident than an act of terrorism. And I say that on these hallowed ground. We are 35 times as likely to die from cancer or heart disease than from violent death in any form. Yet research tells us we perceive those fears in reverse. Our fear of terrorism is exponentially higher than dying in our cars. We live in a landscape of distorted risk. We live in a society where our perceived fears are amplified such that we lose sight of our society's real challenges. Every day we read about terrorism, home invasions, kidnappings, refugee flows, all the horrific but anomalistic events that occur in our modern world, and we should hear about that. But however unintentional, news reporting plays an intrinsic role in molding perceptions of reality that conflict with actual reality. What should really concern me in my community? If I enter a polling booth with a distorted sense of societal risk, might that not skew how I consider various issues or candidates? If we believe the role of journalism is giving citizens the information they need to be informed citizens, might we provide more context? Was there a trend of home invasions, or was it a rare occurrence? Can we close the gap between irrational fear and rational fear? Can we build a foundation of statistical knowledge to help provide context? In the United States, we at Google have a project called Common Knowledge. It's an expansive corpus of data on thousands of topics across the United States, largely government data. We're working with newsrooms like those of McClatchy to make it easy for journalists to embed that nugget of data-driven context to distinguish a disturbing anomaly from a dangerous trend. How might we adapt to the media forms our cultures are adopting? The underlying assumption of a democratic society in the profession of journalism is this: if we express our ideas with the right words, the logical arguments, if enough people read those words, then our democracies will be effective and the world will be a better place. Again, the internet and new media forms have rearranged social, political, and cultural structures. We see it with social media. We see it with short-form video. The messages get shorter. An inescapable progression or digression, depending on your view of how we communicate, of how we understand the society we live in. We can't ignore that. Kevin Munger argues that forms of human conversation have an overwhelming influence on what ideas we can conveniently express. And what ideas are convenient to express inevitably become the important content of our culture. I'm not suggesting TikTok is the future of journalism, though in its own crowdsourced way, it is a medium of journalistic expression. We need to adapt to the language constructs of our time. Last but not least, how can we reach those who don't care or lost interest? Only 10% of us regularly consume what we might call serious news. The Reuters Institute tells us even fewer pay for news. We hear it from our friends. They avoid the news. It makes them sad or anxious or fearful. They find solace in other ways, binging on the latest on Netflix or feeding their addiction to TikTok, and I'm one of them. I recalled what Neil Postman said about television in 1985. We are amusing ourselves to death. What George Orwell feared were those who would ban books. What Aldous Huxley feared was that there would be no reason to ban books, for there would be no one who wanted to read one. Orwell feared those who would deprive us of information. Huxley feared those who would give us so much that we would be reduced to passivity and egoism. Orwell feared the truth would be concealed from us. Huxley feared the truth would be drowned in a sea of irrelevance. I fear both are correct. As Huxley noted in Brave New World Revisited, the civil libertarians, always on the alert to oppose tyranny, fail to take into account men's almost infinite appetite for distractions. In Orwell's 1984, Huxley added, "People are controlled by inflicting pain. In Brave New World, they are controlled by inflicting pleasure." In short, Orwell feared that what we hate will ruin us. Huxley feared that what we love will ruin us. I suspect you're thinking he didn't mention the business model. Everyone says it's broken. It's broken and it's not. Yes, the model of rich, near-monopoly metropolitan newspapers will never return. In 1985, newspapers were the internet before there was one. But now we have the internet. Classified ads went to online marketplaces, department stores got smothered by e-commerce, printed food coupons became loyalty programs. There went that business model. That was 80% of their revenue. But it's not broken for the journalism entrepreneurs I know. It's not broken for Maria Ressa. It's not broken for Paula Miraglia in Brazil. They didn't launch their ventures thinking they had no path to success. They launched those ventures because they knew there were voids to fill, opportunities to harvest. Many are succeeding. Lots of hard work, long nights of stressful doubt, but they believe, and every day we see proof. It's no longer a question of whether news ventures can succeed. Now it's about sharing the formulas of those who have succeeded. How do we scale the success of some to many? With every advance in media distribution across history, there was an early phase of exploration. Failure, success, evolution. And then it became clear what the models for local radio would be, or in their time, alternative weeklies. We are now at that second phase where successful models can be propagated. Yes, I asked no question relating to the business model because every question I've asked is critical to a successful news organization, both journalistically and financially. They are foundational. The answers are the path to success, whatever the answers might be. It was one of the great Greeks who said, "Our open societies, our democracies, will be destroyed by the freedoms we enable." Wise words, terrifying words. They hit a little too close to home. The political sphere has adapted to the capabilities of the internet to speak to voters, to build political alliances, far more quickly and effectively than the world of journalism. I joined Google years ago because I felt as a search engine for the web and as an operator of open ad marketplaces that it was a great place to be. As an early mentor said, when I was, I think, in my early 20s, if you're interested in the future of media, in the future of journalism, understand the technology. It sets the boundaries and the rules of the playing field that we engage on. What also drew me was this. The value of Google search is greatest in open societies. The value of our ad business is greatest in open societies. The impact of journalism is also greatest in open societies. We have common objectives, a common sense of mission. It's why I am passionate about my work. It's why I'm inspired by people like Zara and Jerry and Maria and Dimitri. The challenges are as complex as they are critical, indeed existential. We'll need a close understanding of the challenges and the collective wisdom to address them. I am optimistic, though it's hard to be these days. There are impassioned journalists and editors and entrepreneurs and technologists focusing on these questions, but we need more of them, and we need it quickly. I thank you again for your time. I thank you hugely for the honor. Thanks.
We're going to take some questions from the audience.
Absolutely. I think that we can, since we have the opportunity to have Richard with us here, I think we should get the full advantage of this opportunity. And I think that we can have like 10 more minutes to take some questions. And I would like to ask Michael Conniff, the board member of the association, to manage the conversation. And I will let it to Michael, who is more experienced than I am.
Can we get Jerry up there too? Jerry?
Yes, please.
While we're setting up, I wanted to. I guess you'll share the mic. I wanted to ask, Jerry said, you write for yourself. Thanos and Richard said, we're not in different ways, sort of, we're not, how are we engaging as much as we should with society? So how do you, Jerry, reconcile that with the engagement with the larger society, and how do you, in turn?
My own view, obviously I've been around a fairly long time. I'm not the oldest person at Google, but close to it.
Stop bragging.
I think in a sense, sometimes it's reflected in the notion of the priesthood of journalism. It's like, and I understand historically, in a sense, we spoke to that audience beneath us. But again, the world has changed. People can speak back. And in this very complex, divisive world, if we're not listening to them and engaging with them, I don't know how we solve the problem. As I mentioned, my concern about partisan news, I don't think that helps no matter what side of the aisle they're on. We have to build bridges. If we don't build bridges, I don't feel we have a future. Not only in journalism, but as open societies. Do not forget that in the last 15 years, at least 10 democracies have elected authoritarians, and it doesn't seem we're done.
As regards to writing the truth, telling the truth, you'll pay a price. When I was talking here, I said the oldest punishment in the world is to be banished from your tribe. What I didn't say, what I intended to say, that those who speak the truth risk that banishment. You won't be banished by your peers. Your peers will always respect you. But ultimately, and I had to go through some very hard times to realize this, is that you will respect yourself. And ultimately, that is what is crucial. You must be able to sleep at night.
Great answer.
Sometimes, by the way, our linguistics get in the way. Jerry's right. The professional journalism is seeking the truth. But I gotta tell you, if you tell your audience that you are the truth, you will lose them. Especially journalism, right? It's the first draft of history, right? So you have to convince them that your interest is theirs, and your interest is to give them the information to help them come to conclusions, not tell them, not preach them, not tell them you are the only source of truth.
Not that you are above them.
Yeah.
Not that everybody at the New York Times went to an Ivy League school or something like that, which you hear this criticism a lot. You have to be with and among the people 100%. As soon as you try to come in, and foreign correspondents in third world countries, if I go there, the worst thing I can do, I would hope never do this. Oh, I am here from America. I'm here to learn about you. No. I am here to learn from you. Please help me.
Great answers. Questions? A bunch of journalists are going to have questions. Anyone? Yes, sir. Bob Rowley, a great foreign correspondent himself.
Hi, thank you all for your presentations. They were really inspiring. Richard, I want to ask you a little bit about data and how you can reach out to the community, because I know Google works with my school, the Medill School of Journalism, in trying to create data, collect data from the community to figure out how we reestablish that allegiance to a local newspaper or a local news source or a new news source. Can you talk a little, please, about that?
I mean, I think that's important for so many reasons. Some I talked about, some I didn't mention, right? Do you understand your community? Do you understand their needs? Do you understand the issues that they face? When I got the Common Knowledge Project off the ground, I often spoke to it as a metaphor. I said, you know, the weather report is something we all go to understand whether or not we should need a raincoat or not. But maybe we should do a weather report for our communities that tracks the key metrics. Is our crime rate above or below the norm, right? How do we help them understand what's real and not what's not? The second that I didn't talk about, that we've worked a lot with Medill on, we've developed tools for investigative journalists to help them analyze large corpora of data. The Boston Globe won a Pulitzer looking at, you know, copious reports about bad truck driving habits and so on and so forth, right? How do we equip journalists with the superpowers, with the tools to analyze large amounts of information which would be untenable or possible only for the biggest, most well-supported newsrooms? I think that's really critical. Are we, you know, where's Reporter's Notebook 2.0, 3.0, 4.0 to help journalists be more effective and save their time?
Oh, I cannot say anything beyond that. That is your domain entirely when it comes to data.
Can I? Hi, my name is Khushbu. I'm one of the scholarship awardees at the Foreign Press Correspondents USA. I'm from Columbia Journalism School. My question is about diversity in newsrooms. How do you see, you have both worked in international newsrooms, how do you see international students, international correspondents from different parts of the world, from different communities, from different colors, you know, tackling misinformation? The problem of misinformation is also, as I see it, that only one type of people are giving information all over the world. So how do you see diversity in newsroom tackling the problem of misinformation?
That is a very hard and very delicate question to answer. But I will tell you what I have observed. Having been at CBS for 17 years, I'm a consultant at 60 Minutes, although I'm no longer on a contract at CBS. So I will tell you, what I have observed is that you better be white, Anglo, pretty much, that world to make it. I know of a very talented young woman who, I went to the University of Oregon. She went to Oregon. I kind of mentored her, but she was an Arab. She had an Arab heritage. And I remember the conversation that she had with the senior vice president. That's better for you to look elsewhere because there's only so far that you can go. And it speaks a little bit to what Richard knows so well, and that very compelling, for me, it's fascinating, all the information that he has in his head, is that the corporation has stockholders, and they need to reach as many people as possible because NBC is going to have a wider audience, and therefore it can charge more for its an advertisement. And so you want to keep the most people watching your network. Therefore, you want to make them comfortable. Therefore, don't bother them with somebody who is maybe not. Now, it's changing. It is definitely changing. I think, I'll just take CBS. I think it's changed enormously since Susan Zirinsky took over. There's a lot more women coming in, and I see a lot more minorities coming in. But when I first got here, the story I told you was true, and it's very sad. But that's how it was. I'm watching real closely, just I know a little bit about television now. I'm watching real closely Channel 13 when they have an extremely capable correspondent of Pakistani heritage. I think she's marvelous. Are they going to, she's chief correspondent when Judy Woodruff retires. Are they going to give it to her? She's by far, I think, the best one on television. It'll be very interesting. But it all comes down to what Richard told us so clearly was It's money, it's your share, and it's stock, and it's keeping the stockholders happy, and all those necessary things in a capitalist society such as ours. That is my view on it. So I think it's very hard, but I think it is changing. It is getting better, but it's going slowly. And it's probably even harder for a woman than a man. But it is changing, definitely.
On challenges like this, I always try to find the filter of pragmatic self-interest. If you're a newsroom trying to service your community and you don't have diverse perspectives in that newsroom, how can you possibly pull that off? And also, back to the trust project. One of the key things that Sally learned in the research is people's perception of trust of that news institution is very much about, do they see themselves reflected in that organization? If all I see is a bunch of white male faces, not surprisingly, I'm going to say maybe not. So there are obviously all kinds of beautiful, important philosophical reasons to do this, but I always sort of say, like, just kind of let's figure out how we kind of appeal to your self-interest in making some moves in this direction. And, you know, obviously some progress is being made, but a ton more needs to happen. Well, Google doesn't have a newsroom, right? You know, we have like 150,000 people. On the one hand, I've never been in an environment that was more a cultural polyglot. You know, I work with engineers from around the world. I'm always astonished. Now, I will not stand here and suggest, have we gotten to the absolute right points in terms of gender diversity, in terms of racial diversity? No. I do think there are well-intentioned efforts to continue to make progress with that, but no, we're not there yet.
Happening in Afghanistan and, for example, even in Ukraine. How do you see it?
I remember when, after 9/11, I did an interview with not a national, but a local Portland, Oregon CBS affiliate. And I said I was opposed to the American invasion of Afghanistan. And not only did I receive reprimands around CBS, but from my father. What are you doing? How can you talk like this? Are you anti-American? You spend so much that I would talk like that. I knew, and everybody hates someone who said, I told you so, but I was afraid about ultimately because I knew who the Mujahideen were. I knew who they're like. They're not going to give in, and we're going to run into the same thing. And how does a Christian nation, ostensibly a Christian nation, expect to go into a very isolated, among all Muslim nations, the most isolated, and 70+% of Afghans live in villages, 99% of which do not have electricity or running water. Very, very strong Muslims who are opposed to, for example, Bollywood for ruining their country now. Movies from India that would come in and affect the population. How do we expect to turn that into a democratic Christian capitalist, capitalism, that's not such a problem because fundamentally I'd say Afghans, like everybody, buy and sell trade society. It's totally wrong, and no one yet will accept our defeat. Afghanistan's big problem is, or the Taliban's main problem is, that they defeated in so many ways America, so we're not going to in any way try to help them. But to go in and try to create write a new constitution and to create a democracy when the essence of democracy is the rule of man, the essence of Islam is the rule of God. How do you expect to turn people around? What kind of arrogance do you have that you expect to do that? I think it still exists. I don't think it's changed. What we did, we turned Afghanistan. What really happened on this, and you look back on this, is that And Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, came out in 1999 in an interview with Le Nouvel Observateur, a French magazine, not unlike Newsweek or Time, and said our goal was to lure, he said this publicly, and he used the word lure, the Soviets into Afghanistan to pay the Soviets back for backing the North Vietnamese in our war with Vietnam. In Vietnam, our war against communism. We had a crusade against communism. We lost 55 plus American soldiers. After the last two Americans, they were both Marines, were killed in 1973, what did we do? We transferred our war against the Soviet Union to Afghanistan and used Afghanistan as our proxy battlefield to fight the Soviet Union. I better not read sometime in the future that somehow we lured in some way Putin into I don't think so by any means, into Ukraine. Everybody in this room, most people are astonished and so humbled by their courage. But once again, we are using another country to fight our war with Russia. We have to be, and it's very hard for journalists to say that, because how can you say anything against people who are so courageous?
For one more question, we got it back here actually.
Hello, my name is Andres Correa. I'm from Venezuela. I have been here 15 years, but thank you for your wise words. I really enjoyed when you said that so many autocrats have become democratically elected, and that's clearly a risk all over. I know about it, and now here. But my main concern right now in the US is how, from the journalist point of view, how race and gender are becoming so hot topics that even something as simple as pronouns, when you are addressing someone or writing about someone, could get you in real trouble, not to mention the race topic, especially after 2020 with all the riots here in New York and all over. So my question is, don't you see that as a clearly risk of censorship for journalists right now here in the US? And how do you suggest to deal with that? Thank you.
That's a very interesting question and a very hard one. And obviously, whatever I say here, this is my personal views, not Google. Clearly, we have tremendous, deep, embedded challenges with racism and sexism in our society. That is nowhere near over. But I think we also, politically, have to be very careful, because I fear that we are defeating our own objectives by making this too often such an extreme perspective on either sides that we're losing people. Right? I said, you cannot have a functioning democracy without having a way of bridging differences. You can't have a path forward if we punish people for everything of the past, whether they were directly responsible for it or not. And I think that's what's so dangerous today, right? We got to give people a belief, no matter who you are, what color, white, what gender, doesn't matter. But if you can't give people a sense of how to move forward, then we're not going to get there. And I know it's hard, and I know it's really tricky, but I frankly am terrified in our political climate here, because I think to some degree we can end up shooting ourselves in the foot.
I agree with that. I think that, and we've seen, I don't need to say I think, we see daily the antagonism toward any new change. And what people want, so much of the country wants, and I think Trump really played on this, is we want to, move the clock back. We want to change. We want it to be where the woman stays at home and cooks and raises the children. We don't like the idea, or not we, that there's a segment of society, a large segment of society, that is opposed to anything that that others will call progressive. And it's because the world, and Richard's world, which is something that is so powerful and is so new and is so hard for so many of us to grasp, that dominates us, that our country is moving away from the country that we always knew. And I think there's a certain fear among people that if women too high is going to, and very much, this comes out of the Bush administration and I think Rumsfeld and company, they wanted to more militarize America. It's more of the white man should lead and not the woman. And there's very much, I felt that it started to come up. It had a lot to do with Afghanistan, of course, but to make America, great again, to make America what it was. And there is vast changes. And unfortunately, and I grew up in the West, in Washington State, and so Richard will let me get away with this, he's from California, so much comes from the coast, so much, all new things come from California or from the West Coast, I think. Yes, and they come from these, so the vast inner part of the country that is tied to or feels an allegiance to Trump and to that very strong element in the Republican Party that is once a more traditional society is very much opposed to all this stuff that comes from the coasts.
If I could add one more thing. Societies move forward based on their advances, based on their learned mistakes. If we don't create paths of redemption, I don't think we get there. I think we forget about the need to provide paths for redemption. Otherwise, we don't get beyond the mistakes of the past.
Thank you. Is this working? Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone.
Hello from London. Daniel Faitawa here, President of London's Foreign Press Association, which, as you probably know, was the first association of international correspondents in the world and is still the biggest, running up to its 135th anniversary in 2023. Well, who'd have thought all those years ago that press freedom is still such a live issue in the 21st century. But it is sadly true that now more than ever, at a time when accurate fact-based reporting is increasingly under attack, when fake truths are spread so easily on social media platforms, that this World Press Freedom Day is here to remind us that our profession has never been more important. Information is power. Without facts, we can't get to the truth. Without the truth, we lose trust, and most importantly, we lose freedom. Throughout the COVID-19 pandemic and the devastating war in Ukraine, which I've been personally covering inside Ukraine and along Eastern Europe, I've seen with my very own eyes how much journalism matters and why journalists risk their lives to tell the truth in some of the most dangerous places in the world in order to give a voice to the voiceless. Today, we need to remember all those colleagues who've lost their lives in pursuit of the truth. Like you, we're also marking World Press Freedom Day here in Britain's capital. I passionately believe that journalism makes democracy stronger, and we need everyone to stand united for our right to do our job unfettered and uncensored this World Press Freedom Day. Stay safe.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak here today and to join so many other respected journalists and communications professionals. I wish I could be there in person. The Press Freedom Forum is such an important assembly at this time, especially with everything that is happening in the world. As you may know, the Hollywood Foreign Press Association never forgot its origins when we were born during the dark days of World War II as a means of supporting foreign correspondents in Hollywood to spread some snappy entertainment stories to beleaguered people around the world. Many of our members do not head into war zones as part of their working responsibilities, but our respect for those journalists who put themselves in harm's way by covering unfriendly and broken governments is monumental. That is why we donated funds to the Committee to Protect Journalists to help support the evacuation of Afghan journalists during the collapse in Afghanistan. That's also why we made another recent donation to the committee in support of our colleagues covering the war in Ukraine and to help the fight for press freedom in Russia. Our fellow journalists are keeping the fire alive for all of us who choose a profession that involves keyboards, video cameras, notepads, and pencils. But as others I'm sure have already expressed, the threats to our profession are not only bombs and bullets, but also changed economic conditions and the growth of social media that has created so much good in terms of keeping the world looped in, but also caused great chaos with disinformation and false rumors. As entertainment journalists, the Hollywood Foreign Press Association has seen a shrinkage in our professional ranks as media outlets push to use syndicated content and cut ties to overseas bureaus. There's a growing sameness to reporting that poses a threat to our ability to tell intimate, powerful, and unseen stories to readers and viewers. Even as Hollywood and Silicon Valley have exploded with streamers in a fight for international subscriber growth, the riddle of how to sustain international journalism as a growth model has proven difficult in today's economy. By 2026, it is estimated that the job market in journalism will shrink by 10%. This echoes a trend that has seen employment in journalism continuously decline since 2008. We also know that the typical journalism salary is below the national average, which places enormous strain on the ability to earn a living in major urban centers around the world, as well as more far-flung areas of the globe that are underrepresented. All these forces impact on the freedom and ability of the press to do their job, no matter if it's writing feature stories about a local election or covering the largest war in Europe since World War II. What does matter is for all of us as journalists to continue to stand up for our colleagues and for our profession, no matter who makes an attack or questions our integrity. As the first on-the-scene chroniclers of history, our stories are the imprint by which future historians and generations build their history lessons. I'm so proud to be able to speak to you on Press Freedom Day, and I'm so happy to see the continued work of protecting the freedom and the integrity of journalists. Thank you so much.
My name is Guilherme Canella, and I'm the chief of the UNESCO's Freedom of Expression and Safety of Journalists Department. A very happy World Press Freedom Day to each and every one of you. I'm sure we are all asking ourselves, do we have reasons to celebrate this day? Yes, we do. The advancements for freedom of expression in general and press freedom in particular in the last 30 years, when the World Press Freedom Day started to be celebrated, are enormous. Let me just mention three. Digital technologies offered to humanity the greatest opportunity since Gutenberg for expanding freedom of expression. 30 years ago, we have only a dozen countries with freedom of information laws. Today, there are more than 130. Third, investigative journalism, particularly transborder cooperation, has just skyrocketed. Panama Papers, Pandora Papers, Forbidden Stories, you name it. Yet, we can't take these advancements for granted. Last UNESCO's World Trends Report on Freedom of Expression and Media Development shows that in the last 5 years, 85% of the world's population has experienced some decline in press freedom indicators. More than 400 journalists were killed. The pandemic has exacerbated a perfect storm for draconian regulations against freedom of expression, physical, digital, legal attacks against journalists, economic difficulties to keep independent, pluralistic, and free media viable, and all of this in the middle of the biggest wave of disinformation and misinformation we have ever witnessed. That's why the international community, led by UNESCO, keeps insisting we need to protect journalism as a public good. In fact, if you observe well, there are two public goods that are particularly attacked by authoritarian rulers when they come to power: press freedom and rule of law. Authoritarian regimes don't like independent journalism and independent judges. Democracies can't be consolidated without these key players for the checks and balances mechanisms. Without independent journalism, it becomes really hard to fight corruption, human rights violations, environmental crimes, war crimes. As the Nobel Peace Committee has underlined in awarding Maria Ressa and Dmitry Muratov last year, freedom of expression and freedom of information help to ensure an informed public. These rights are crucial prerequisites for democracy and protect against war and conflict. This year's World Press Freedom Day celebration is inviting us to recognize that journalism is under a digital siege. Surveillance, digital harassment, particularly against women journalists, hacking, doxing, disinformation campaigns are just some of the problems experienced by journalists everywhere. Prevention, protection, and prosecution of these crimes are desperately needed. The World Press Freedom Day is a tribute to all of you. It is a recognition of the peoples of the world that what you do, the risks you take, matter. They are key to enhance our democratic values, to protect and promote human rights, to foster inclusive and sustainable development. Thank you for your courage. Thank you for keeping the powerful accountable. Thank you for demonstrating every day that information saves lives and that journalism is indeed a public good. Happy World Press Freedom Day.
Hello, my name is Ernest Sagaga. I am head of the Department for Human Rights and Safety of Journalists at the International Federation of Journalists based here in Brussels. Thank you very much for the opportunity to contribute to your debate today about press freedom. Now, I speak to you today from the Brussels Press Club, where we have just launched the annual report on the safety of journalists published by the Council of Europe and its partner organizations, including my own, the IFJ. And those of you who operate on a global level, you will agree with me that the continent of Europe, in comparison to other regions of the world, actually fares much better in terms of press freedom. Yet, even Europe, including the European Union, our report has shown that there are issues of concern to journalists, ranging from detention, arbitrary arrest, harassment, physical attacks, up to and including killings. Last year alone, we have recorded at least 6 killings of journalists in Europe. But as I was saying, this has nothing to do or pales in comparison to what is happening in many regions of the world. We saw in Afghanistan, for instance, last year, where scores, probably thousands of journalists have had to leave their country to escape arrest or even worse. We're seeing now in Ukraine with the war in that country, at least 10 journalists have been killed since the start of the invasion by Russia in Ukraine. So it is true to say that journalism is under threat all over the world. We're not only talking about countries at war or what we call failed states, we're also talking about countries where there is supposed to be liberal democracy, rule of law. we are witnessing attempts to muzzle press freedom, including by what we call SLAP, that is strategic litigation against public participation, which is basically a way of intimidating journalists through litigation and stop them from investigating or reporting on some sensible issues. We are also looking at what we call media capture, whereby governments actually tend to pack newsrooms with their cronies to ensure that those newspapers, radio, and TV stations actually toe the official line. And therefore, it's important for you and us everywhere in the world to look at these set of affairs and decide what can be done. And there are things which can be done. For instance, in Europe, as our report just shown, some member states are actually taking steps to defend press freedom and defend journalists. This year, we are going to be discussing the 10th anniversary of the UN plan on the safety of journalists and the issue of impunity. This is a very important milestone, and we need all your contribution to how we can improve on that report, and then we can make a difference in the lives of many journalists in many countries, including Afghanistan, including Mexico, including other countries where journalists are still being killed, are still being arrested, and are still being jailed just for doing their job. So I want to thank you again for inviting me, and thank you for organizing this debate, and look forward to your contribution. And please feel free to keep in touch and let us know what we can do to help you in your work. Thank you very much.
Hello. Thank you to the Association of Foreign Press Correspondents for inviting me to speak to you briefly on behalf of Reporters Without Borders, and for hosting this great forum at a time when these issues could not be more vital. Over 1,000 journalists and media personnel have been killed while exercising their profession over the last 15 years. At RSF, we're committed not just to documenting and highlighting the negative conditions facing journalists or naming and shaming the regimes that commit them, but actively improving the situation by ending impunity for crimes against journalists. In conflict zones such as Syria and Ukraine, journalists are being deliberately targeted. 7 journalists have been killed in Ukraine since the war began, 11 injured, 2 have disappeared, many more have been shot at, harassed, or detained. RSF is documenting each and every case, and it is essential that we hold responsible parties accountable. We cannot allow journalists to be targeted with impunity. From the outset of Russia's invasion, RSF knew we had to be involved on the ground. That's why we rushed to set up the Lviv Press Freedom Center, a hub for all journalists who are covering the conflict. Located in the western Ukrainian city of Lviv, the Press Freedom Center is a place where any reporter can go to collect protective gear like helmets, bulletproof vests. They can get financial and digital security support. They can even just find a quiet place to charge their phone and file their story. We're also proud to work with Russian journalists by giving them the resources they need to continue doing their vital work, whether that's setting up digital mirrors for their websites to circumvent state blocking, or if it's providing the means for them to do their work in exile through our JX Fund, which is supporting Russian journalists in exile. But the dangers facing journalists are not limited to war zones, and even right here in our North American backyard, 7 journalists have been killed in Mexico in 2022 alone. And again, the murders of these reporters are carried out with total impunity. In fact, far too often, the killers, kidnappers, or jailers of reporters are able to act with impunity. 3.5 years ago, Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi was brutally murdered and dismembered in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul on the orders of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. We're still waiting for justice, and it looks like we'll be waiting for some time. This month, the Turkish prosecutor in charge of the case recommended sending the trial to Saudi Arabia, which would effectively end any hope of justice for Jamal. Allowing a culture of impunity to persist when it comes to crimes against journalists only encourages more of the same. As I said, this is a global problem. It therefore requires a global solution. One solution, which RSF is advocating for, is the creation of a special envoy for the protection of journalists. This would give the international community a concrete mechanism to support international law and protect journalists worldwide. It's a vital step towards ending the impunity, and we are calling on all the governments of the world to support a resolution at the United Nations to create such an envoy. Thank you for holding this session. Thank you for inviting me to speak.
I am Vicent Portal. I'm the managing director of VilaWeb in Catalonia, but also I'm the chairman of the board of directors of the European Journalist Center. Our organization, based in Maastricht in the Netherlands, works all over Europe, trying to help people to improve the quality of journalism in our continent, defending press freedom, and helping all of us to adapt to the new environment where we are living. So because of that, I'm very happy to salute you in this event organized by the Foreign Press Correspondents on the Press Freedom Day. In 1959, the great novelist and journalist Albert Camus, he was working on the Le Soir Républicain, a newspaper based in Oran in Algeria, then a French colony. He was facing a strong suppression of the rights and strong censorship. Once, Camus wrote a powerful manifesto on why people must defend freedom of press. And I agree very much with the essential, with the core of these words that he pronounced. He said, when the freedom is under threat anywhere, the question is no longer a political question, but a personal question. And every one of us must understand what we can do as individuals to defend our rights. So I cannot be more happy to meet the people that you are together here in New York. And let me have just a few words, a couple of words, to remember our colleagues in Ukraine who are facing probably the worst situation any journalist can face, and also our brave Russian colleagues like the ones of Novaya Gazeta that are fighting against censorship and disinformation also in Russia.
I'm Irving Washington, Executive Director and CEO of the Online News Association. On behalf of our board, staff, and members, we stand in solidarity with journalists around the globe as we celebrate World Press Freedom Day with the Association of Foreign Press Correspondents, USA. At ONA, our members are digital journalists working across all media platforms worldwide. Our mission is to be at the center of innovation, journalism, and technology. But we know that despite all of the incredible technological advances over the last several years, it has also created even more advancements to threaten press freedom. Unfortunately, in too many places around the world, a free press is under attack by not only disinformation, but direct attacks of harassment and the killing of journalists. Amid those threats, we've also seen now more than ever how journalism and journalists are vital to democracies under threats. Whether that's telling the heartbreaking stories of war, holding the ever more powerful governments accountable, or challenging the structural inequities we face across the world. It's vital that we have a free press. So on this day, despite our challenges, we must celebrate and honor journalists everywhere, but especially those risking their own freedom and lives. For that, we say thank you.
Hello everyone, I'm Aisha Tanzim, the newly appointed director of the South and Central Asia Division at the Voice of America. I'm really excited to be here with you because you, who've lived and worked across the globe, understand, probably more than most, the value of being able to report without fear. In my region, fear is a daily part of a journalist's life. The fear of losing your job, your freedom, your life, or maybe the life of a loved one. I have seen up close, sometimes too close, what happens to journalism when fear lurks in the air around you. I have recently returned from Afghanistan and Pakistan, where I lived and worked for 7 years as a correspondent and bureau chief. I was there the day the Taliban took over Kabul. I witnessed, with our own reporters, but also others who became friends over the years, how the Taliban played good cop, bad cop with all of us. Their suave English-speaking spokesman, and they were always spokesmen, would promise protection for our journalists. Their intelligence wing, on the other hand, would pick up anyone daring to do a story critical of the Taliban. Afghanistan's once vibrant media now heavily self-censors. Many journalists, most of them female, have either fled the country or stopped working. Cross the border into Pakistan and the media operates under a facade of freedom. Dozens of television and radio channels churn out hundreds of hours of news every day, blasting politicians of all sides. But the real power, the military, is off limits. News directors, many of them my friends, receive phone calls on what to air and what to censor. Reporters receive instructions through WhatsApp messages. Dissent is costly. I have stood outside a hospital emergency room praying for a journalist friend who was shot and was fighting for his life. Move further east, and the current regime in the world's most populous democracy, India, is using state apparatus to harass, intimidate, or even jail journalists. Recently, a group of 58 human rights groups and media outlets wrote an open letter to the Lieutenant Governor of the Jammu and Kashmir region in India, asking him to stop the policy of harassment and intimidation. In Central Asia, free media is a dream. The only source of free and objective news are foreign, like the local language services of the VOA, the BBC, Deutsche Welle, or RFERL. This all sounds really bad, but there's an even bigger problem now. In South and Central Asia, when there was no free media, it was simpler. The audience knew. Now, in many countries, there's a facade of free media. Truth does not matter. There is so much fake news out there, and the lies are so pervasive that the audience is genuinely confused. Social media and the culture of buying bots has just exacerbated the problem. To me, this is the biggest threat journalism faces today. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Kevin Goldberg, and I am excited to speak on behalf of the Freedom Forum, where I work full-time as the First Amendment Specialist, and the National Press Foundation, for whom I serve on the board of directors. Thank you for letting me celebrate World Press Freedom Day with you today. It is a day that is near and dear to my heart. I am proud to have traveled to more than 15 countries around the world to advocate for press freedom, and have likely worked with journalists from double to triple that number who have traveled to the United States. I know that a free press remains crucial to the fate of democracy and human rights around the world. But the legal and physical threats endured by foreign journalists are now occurring in the United States as well. Of particular concern are the threats to journalism's societal standing. In 2021, the Freedom Forum released our Where America Stands survey. Of more than 3,000 people surveyed in the summer of 2020, 94% feel the First Amendment is vital. But the strong overall reverence for the First Amendment does not carry over to the press. Only 14% trust journalists, and 41% say journalists are a threat to the First Amendment. But know that you are appreciated. Both the organizations I'm representing today are honoring the best in journalism and the First Amendment this week. On April 28th, the Freedom Forum held our annual Free Expression Awards celebrating champions of free expression, while the National Press Foundation holds its annual awards dinner on May 4th. I point this out not to promote these organizations or events, but to inspire you and remind you that we will always be fighting for you because journalism matters. A free press can lead individuals in checking the power of government in so many ways. Governments are stronger than individuals, but protecting news gathering and publication ensures it is not government versus individual, it's government versus 1 million, or in the case of the United States, 330 million. As the European Court of Human Rights said in the 1999 case of Bladet Tromsø and Stansas versus Norway, the media as a whole merits special protection under freedom of expression, in part because of their role in making public information and ideas on matters of public interest. Not only does the press have the task of imparting such information and ideas, the public also has a right to receive them. And though they may not always express it, the public does appreciate you. That same Freedom Forum survey that relayed negative attitudes about the press also showed that Americans don't want to be so skeptical, as 58% of those surveyed agree the news media should act as a watchdog on government. The world is increasingly interconnected. What happens in Washington, D.C. has always had an impact worldwide, but what happens elsewhere affects Washington, D.C. We can communicate instantly with each other across boundaries and across thousands of miles. There is no evading the fact that we are all connected, that we all share the same goals, and therefore should all strive to share the same goal of the free flow of information as well. That is why World Press Freedom Day remains so vital. Thank you for all that you do.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mitzi, Perdue, and I'm one of your sponsors for this event. And I just wanted to send a greeting your way. For that matter, I wanted to send some love your way, because in truth, I think it's almost impossible to express how important, at least I feel, that the profession of journalism is. It was my profession for most of my adult life. Now, at 81, I'm not an active journalist. I write instead. I just finished this book. Anybody wants to interview me about it, please do. It's about Mark Victor Hansen, the Chicken Soup for the Soul Guide. And yeah, there's a chance that you know about that series because, gosh, it was translated into 57 different languages and sold 500 million books. So what I've been doing instead of journalism these days is writing books. But back to you, because this is about you, not about me. I do want to send some love your way because I know that your work makes democracy possible. Thanks, guys.
Hi, all. On behalf of the Association and Club of Foreign Press Correspondents in the USA, welcome to our panel discussion on global threats to press freedom. I'm Bob Rowley, a member of the board of the association and a lecturer at Northwestern University. I'm delighted to have you all join us as we mark Press Freedom Day around the world. And to start, I especially want to thank our distinguished panelists for taking the time to discuss these critically important issues and the wide-ranging global threats to press freedom. Each of our panelists has made a distinctive contribution to our tumultuous, changing business over the last few decades. It's an honor to sit with them virtually and discuss challenges and solutions that impact us all, including so many foreign correspondents covering America. I want to welcome our audience of foreign correspondents from around the country and the globe, tuning into this discussion, as well as students and others. As we all know, journalists at home and abroad face increasingly hostile threats in our age of division and disinformation. These include the obvious physical dangers covering conflicts, but also, notably in the war in Ukraine, where we've lost 7 civilian journalists so far this year, but also the threats from dictators, propaganda, and the global assault on truth. Given this ever more hostile environment, never has the work of independent journalists been so important in finding the facts, seeking the truth, and reporting it as objectively as humanly possible. As the British playwright Tom Stoppard wrote, information is light. Information in itself about anything is light. And what you all do is shine an independent light on those darker corners and oppressive governments of the planet where otherwise many would be living or suffering or dying in darkness, their plight unknown. So first, a little housekeeping. The formal program is an hour long. I'll ask questions of our panelists, and I encourage them to jump in as well if they want to add their voice on a particular subject. Let's get started now. I'd like to introduce our panel. Charles Whitaker is Dean and Professor at Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism, Media, Integrated Marketing Communications. Charles is a double alum from Medill with both an undergraduate and graduate degree, and the first alumnus to serve as dean. He taught on the faculty for 30 years, starting in 1992, from news and magazine writing and editing to blogging. Earlier, he was a senior editor at Ebony Magazine. He also worked for the Miami Herald, the Louisville Times, and has contributed articles to a variety of publications, from the Chicago Tribune and the Philly Inquirer to Jet Magazine and the Saturday Evening Post. Nicholas Lemon is Professor of Journalism, Dean Emeritus, and Director of Columbia World Projects at Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. A graduate of Harvard University, Nick has worked for the Washington Monthly, Texas Monthly, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and the New Yorker, and he continues to contribute to the New Yorker as a staff writer. During his time as Dean of Columbia's Graduate School of Journalism, he oversaw the growth of the faculty and launched major new initiatives in investigative reporting, digital journalism, and executive leadership for news organizations. Margaret Sullivan is the media columnist for the Washington Post, former public editor at the New York Times, and former chief editor at the Buffalo News. Margaret was a member of the Pulitzer Board from 2011 to 12, and she was twice elected as a director of the American Society of Newspaper Editors, where she led the First Amendment Committee. She's a graduate of Georgetown University and earned her master's from Medill at Northwestern. She has taught in the graduate schools of journalism at Columbia University and the City University of New York. And Doreen Weisenhouse is senior lecturer and director of the Media, Law, and Policy Initiative at Northwestern, with appointments both at Medill and at the law school, where she also earned her undergraduate and graduate degrees. Doreen taught media, law, and ethics at the Journalism and Media Studies Center at the University of Hong Kong. Earlier, she was city editor of the New York Times and the first legal editor of the New York Times Magazine, later becoming its law and politics editor. Weisenhouse was also editor-in-chief of the National Law Review and served as a prosecutor in New York City, as well as a news producer in Chicago at WBBM TV. And I've only scratched the surface of their extensive accomplishments, but our audience can find more detailed information about each of our panelists on the Association and Club website for this Press Freedom Day event. So now let's hear from our panel. My first question is for Charles. The press has always faced threats covering wars, and we lost one of our own, Medill grad James Foley, when he was brutally murdered on camera by Islamic State militants in Syria in 2014. Reporters have been murdered by Russian forces in Ukraine, and others are at risk around the world. But dangers to press freedom come from other threats too: arrest, harassment, intimidation, disinformation, and propaganda. Charles, what is it about this moment in time that concerns you most for the next generation of journalists heading into that difficult landscape?
Thank you, Bob, and thank you so much for assembling this panel. You know, I think what disturbs and upsets me most about this moment in time is the global assault on truth and how indifferent it seems so many in the world, but certainly domestically, are to that. We talk a lot about the diminution of news outlets domestically. We don't talk enough about what that really means in terms of what we're losing in terms of watchdogs of the media, you know, people who are upholding truth, who are holding public figures accountable. That means so much more than the loss of journalism jobs. And I think institutions like Medill and other journalism schools have a greater responsibility than just training the next generation of journalists. We actually have to train the public to really understand what it means to lose the press and how critical a time this is. We're seeing all around the world what the global assault on truth is doing and what it means in terms of the loss of life and liberty globally and domestically.
Great, thank you. I'd like to ask our other Dean, Dean Emeritus, a similar question. So over to you, Nick. What concerns you the most about the threats facing journalists from your Dean days onward to and up to the present, and the array of challenges to press freedom at home and around the world today?
Well, I guess speaking of my Dean days, I came here in 2003. The very first meeting I had was with a gentleman named Seymour Topping, former managing editor of the New York Times, who had covered as a correspondent the Chinese Revolution and 5 feet away from Mao, and had kept up ties in China. And he summoned me to his house and he gave me a big and very moving speech about how press freedom is coming to China and Columbia Journalism School has to become part of that trend. And, with all due respect, that hasn't happened yet. And I don't think it's going to happen in my lifetime. There was still, back then, some of that millennial optimism about the US model of press freedom was going to become a global norm in China and in other places. It was almost inevitable. And, you know, we're not in that movie anymore. And it's become clear that a lot of the world, at least a lot of world leaders or holders of power, really don't believe in press freedom as a good idea. That to the extent that press freedom goes with democracy, democracy is in retreat around the world. And here in the US, you know, we still have press freedom, but the picture isn't as rosy as it used to be. There's a big, as anybody in a Foreign Correspondents Association knows, economic threat to the press performing its mission. You have two sitting Supreme Court justices who have essentially tossed into opinions. I wish somebody would give us an invitation to rewrite the standards for libel law in the United States. So that'll happen. So, you know, but it's a nice day here in New York, I'll say that.
Excellent. Now on to Margaret. You've written several recent columns about the threats to press freedom from Vladimir Putin recently. His absurd propaganda portraying Russia as a victim in the war, where Russia has killed literally thousands of civilians, and accusing Ukraine of hiring actors to play corpses in the streets of Ukrainian cities like Bucha that Russia has demolished, and the Kremlin's crackdown on independent press, basically criminalizing truth. Media face jail time if they call a war. Your thoughts?
Well, that's right. I am very concerned about that and have been from the beginning of this invasion, which can't be called an invasion. You know, essentially independent media, independent reporting to a large extent has been run out of Russia. And so, you know, a great deal of the good reporting we're getting, and we're so fortunate to have it. The reporters are very brave, and we're very lucky to know what's going on. But it's you know, these are no longer reporters that are, for the most part, who are in Russia, but rather, you know, in Ukraine or elsewhere. So, you know, it's a very scary time, I think, to be a truth teller about this war. And, you know, you could die, or you could be thrown in prison, or you could be poisoned if you tell the truth. And as you said, Bob, reporting has been criminalized. I mean, it's an overt, clear kind of thing that if you do certain kinds of things, if you use certain kinds of words, that's considered false information. It's fake news in effect, and you will be duly punished. So it's, as you said, war reporting is always dangerous, but here I think even more so because journalism is not being respected. I think it's probably more dangerous at this point to have a vest on that identifies you as press than to not have that, and that's a very scary thing. So there's a lot to be concerned about, and at the same time there's a lot to be grateful for, because I do think that at least we in this country and in the West have had a pretty good picture of what's been happening, but no thanks to the Kremlin or to Putin.
I remember when I was covering the war in Bosnia, reporters, to your point, would take off press because if they saw you with a vest or a press symbol on your car, they would shoot between the letters T and V on the back of your car. So it's very risky. There's I'm afraid this will lose more than the 7 we've lost so far. And Doreen, I want to ask your take on the threats to press freedom in Russia too, where you have friends, and more broadly around the world. You've lived in Hong Kong for many years and have a global perspective. You've seen what happens in China, to Nick's point. You follow the Committee to Protect Journalists' work very closely. What are your biggest concerns, and what do you tell your student journalists who are going to work abroad? think you may be on mute. It looks like you might be on mute.
Yes, sorry. Yes, so I do tell them a lot, right? And knowledge is very important for them to be able to function. But going to Margaret's point about the situation in Russia, it is indeed very, very dire. I have been in touch with media lawyers and journalists who were in Russia who have been forced to leave. I think at last count, over 160 journalists have left Russia to go to other countries, and there are people trying to help them set up to do so. This law that criminalize fake news on how you report, as Margaret pointed out, you can't call it a war, it's a military operation. It really has had such an impact, and already 6 journalists have been under investigation, several have been detained, and many more are likely to come in the time and future. But also, it's not a new phenomenon in Russia. It's this new law, which was instituted in March, is a long line of laws and oppressive legal regimes that have been set up in Russia. In 2019, they had a new law that you couldn't insult the president or any governmental institutions, and they opened up dozens and dozens of cases, particularly if it was online expression. So this is just kind of the latest layer, but obviously one of the most dangerous one because it's impacting not just local journalists, but foreign journalists. The New York Times, for the first time, does not have a reporter in Russia, which is, stunning when you think of its long history of doing that. And so the journalists from abroad who are setting up independent organizations, because over 600 websites of independent media in Russia have been shut down without a court order, without any kind of other intervention, they feel they can't get whatever they come up with back to the people in Russia who are under great restrictions on where they can access their news. And there's a very well organized, well paid propaganda information regime in which they get their information. So that's kind of the dichotomy there. In China, there was some optimism, Nicholas, there for a while, and even when I got there in 2000. So I arrived in 2000, 3 years after the handover of Hong Kong back to China from 1997, after many years of being a British colony. And at first there were fears there might be tanks coming over the border, but there were not. And so there was really quite a wonderful, robust media ecosystem in Hong Kong, and surprisingly, for at least a few years in China as well. It was thought that it would help with their integration and, with the World Trade Organization, with its global markets and so on. And so we documented incredible investigative journalism. But as you very astutely point out, that is long gone. Under current presidency, that is something that has clamped down since his presidency. And in fact, President Biden mentioned in a fundraiser this past week that he's had long conversations with President Xi, who told him that democracies are doomed in the 21st century, that only authoritarian governments can succeed because democracies are messy. It takes too long to get consensus. You can't really, control things. So only authoritarian governments can really work. So what do I tell my students and my journalists abroad class, who want to go there and cover various countries, not just for war, but also politics and so on, that they have to have knowledge. They have to understand where they're going and what the risks are. And the risks are threefold. One is their physical harm. It used to be, you knew if you went to a conflict zone and covering war, that you could be targeted. But it has been documented by UNESCO and others over the last 5 years that the most dangerous beat you can cover is politics, not war. Although we'll find out more what's happening this year. But since 2016, UNESCO has documented that more journalists are killed for covering politics than they were for covering war, although obviously that might change. And then the second thing is arming themselves in terms of the laws they might encounter. So for example, if you are going to Thailand to cover something, you know that there's a law that says that you can't report about the king. And if you make any kind of insult that you could face criminal penalties. A BBC reporter several years ago thought he was safe because he was writing about some possible corruption by the military. But the courts held that no, that implies insult against the king, and therefore he was facing criminal harm and criminal penalties. And fortunately, because he was with the BBC, he was allowed to leave, but others might not be able to. And the third thing I try to warn my students and arm them about is digital security. There's so much more with digital surveillance, so much more in which they need to be able to protect themselves. If they are detained, do they need to turn over their smartphone? So how do they protect themselves with, using VPNs, using encrypted apps and so on. So there's a lot that they need to learn. I think I've scared a few of them from wanting to go abroad, but many of them still feel pretty determined that they want to make their way around the world.
Excellent. Those are some of the things that we've learned people are using to try and get information into Russia, VPNs and mirror sites, and even shortwave radio. I think the BBC and NPR both brought back shortwave radio. Whatever works, we have to get the word out.
Yeah, and there's been crowdsourcing about war crimes in the Ukraine to try to gather this information and make that available. And I think friends that I know from there say that young people for sure know how to do VPNs and how to have this type of encrypted communications, but it's the older generation that may not be as well informed, and the media there looks so professional in terms of the way they communicate, that it definitely creates a disconnect between what's really going on and what they're being told.
Which leads me to my next question for Charles. Charles, back to you. We've talked about the age of disinformation, but it presents real problems for journalists because many Americans can't even agree on the same set of facts these days. How do we battle misinformation and continue to tell the truth enough to be effective?
It is a real problem, especially since so many people now are looking for media that confirms their beliefs, and they're really reject any media that in any way disrupts their belief system. So they do burrow into echo chambers and sort of push out any other disconfirming evidence or news, which means, again, not to be one note here, that means it's more important than ever for us to make media literacy a part of our curricula from a very early age, from elementary school on. And we've been on a campaign here at Medill to infiltrate the Chicago public school system to teach school children to be more discerning readers of media, to teach them the difference between opinion and fact-based media, to teach them to look for reliable news sources and to determine how to distinguish reliable news sources, but also to challenge their own beliefs and read media that doesn't just confirm those. It's a real important part of our educational mission, one that I think most schools have abandoned, but it's critical if we're to get beyond disinformation. I think it's still challenging as long as there are people who are committed to distributing false information and fooling the public. It will be harder and harder, as Doreen said. Many of those things look very legitimate, and it becomes harder for people to discern what's real and what isn't. But I think the more that we talk about that, the more that we create readers who are looking beyond just confirmation of their own notions and ideas, but really are seeking factual information, we stand a better chance of sort of doing battle against those folks who are sort of enemies of the truth.
I've never seen anything like it in my lifetime as it has been in the last 5 years. And Nick, keeping on the disinformation theme, many people in America have died because of misinformation about the threat of COVID-19, much of it deliberate politicization of health policies of this country. And a lot of that misinformation is spread on social media. Do you think we as journalists should embrace former President Obama's call that government more strongly regulate these big social media platforms? Or is that a threat to press freedom too, too much regulation?
Well, this is something that we're all going to have to think about very seriously over the next few years. So if you didn't follow it, President Obama went to Stanford University, heart of Silicon Valley, which was, very supportive of him when he was president, and made a speech last week in which he said, in a very, very couched, cautious way with a lot of caveats, I now believe that we should have media regulation for social media platforms. Here's why it's a tough problem. Like I take Charles's point about media literacy. I come from Louisiana and I come from a big family with many, many, many cousins. They know that the New York Times exists. They know the Chicago Tribune exists. They just don't want to read it. It's not like, oh, I didn't realize that Fox News isn't actually fair and balanced. So, at some point, you can do everything possible to build up good, reliable journalism. You can have a fact-checking sector online. You can have media literacy. And there still is not a perfect fit between a free speech ethic and a truth ethic. Or to put it another way, the First Amendment sort of lumps together free press and free speech, and we journalists are used to thinking that they're the same thing. And seeing the rise of social media in particular, and to some extent deregulated broadcast, really shows you that they're not the same thing. And so a lot of people have been saying this. Obama is the sort of highest ranking person to open this box in a very public way. And so I think we're going to be having a conversation about whether it's possible for us journalists to be, total dedicated advocates of free press and of free speech, knowing that that means there'll be way more misinformation and lies than good information. Are we comfortable with that? And if we're not, are we willing to explore alternatives, which are things that would make us naturally uncomfortable?
Like revising Section 230 of the Communications Decency?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think most Americans don't even know what Section 230 is. So let me tell you.
That's right.
I don't think people sit around in the National Press Club or wherever and talk about Section 230. But I'll just say briefly, it's a very little known provision of a bill called the 1996 Communications Decency Act that essentially says platforms on the internet will be treated the same way the phone company is treated. They're not legally responsible for what they carry. So you can't sue them for libel, slander, anything like that, because all they are is a carrier of material. So, what Obama said was very careful. He didn't say, oh, not for abolishing it all the way, but if you modified it and said, you're now legally responsible, then it really changes the economics for platforms. Fox News has had a couple of big time damage suits over things like the, broadcasting rumors about the 2020 election. And I think it puts the fear of God in them and makes them rethink some of their practices. So that's an interesting weapon that could be used against misinformation.
And any thoughts from anyone on the panel about Elon Musk buying Twitter and the rumors that he may allow Trump back on the platform? Trump said he doesn't want to be there, which makes me convinced he would want to be there, just the way he usually operates. But I worry about that.
Yeah, it's interesting. So as you know, over the last couple of years, Congress has hauled over the top CEOs of the social media platforms. So you see Zuckerberg and you see Jack Dorsey and so on from Twitter giving their positions on whether they would regulate or not regulate. And some say yes, maybe it's time to do some kind of regulation and so on. And so Jack Dorsey, for example, said, during the 2020 elections that Twitter identified over 300,000 tweets that were misinformation surrounding the election, both before and the day of, and then of course in the critical days afterwards. And so it raises questions as to what Twitter's current content moderation policies are, which is to not necessarily to remove them, although they did remove Donald Trump because he had consistent violations of their policies, but also to do the labeling. So the question arises as to what will Twitter look like under Elon Musk? And that's the big question mark.
Exactly. And Margaret, now to you. You wrote in your book, Ghosting the News, about threats to democracy, accountability, and community from the decline of local news. This is another blow to press freedom of a different sort. Most of these local newspapers, some like 1,800 of them, are gone in the last 15 to 20 years and will never come back. How does this tragedy impact press freedom, in your view?
Well, I would love to talk about that, and I will, but before I do, I'd like to simply say that I think that Elon Musk will allow Donald Trump back on Twitter, and Donald Trump will be back on Twitter. I'd be very surprised if those things don't happen. And,
And look how many users he'd get from letting Trump back on.
Sure. I mean, it's, Trump Trump has called himself, this is one time when he's accurate and truthful, he's called himself a ratings machine, and that extends to social media as well. So that's been one of the real problems, and something I've written about a lot is that we're all kind of addicted to Trump in many ways. And I would be very surprised if that plays out in any other way, and I think it will be destructive. But I was lucky to be able to write Ghosting the News, and it came about because of a conversation with Nick Lemon. The publisher is Columbia Global Reports, which he founded and heads up. It is true that, I come from a local news background, and one of the things that we lose when local newspapers and other forms of local news wither is a kind of a sense of people believing more or less the same things that their neighbors do. Like they might have a different opinion about it, but they kind of are both reading and taking in some factual information that their neighbors do as well. And there's this sort of community and a common ground to stand on. And the common ground is the truth, right? So we don't have that now. And so instead we have, Facebook, and we have Nextdoor, and we have Instagram, and we have people just, spreading a bunch of lies, basically. Or as Dean Whitaker said so well, they're looking to have their beliefs affirmed. So I think that anything we can do to continue to shore up what remains of local news, and a lot remains, a lot remains. Most large cities still have a functioning newspaper that does a lot of good. It's not as vibrant, it's not as well staffed, it's not as well circulated as it once was, but it's a lot better than not having it. And so any efforts that can be made, and there are some that are being considered in Congress and have bipartisan support, which is a rarity for anything, I think is really worthwhile. So I would like to put in a plug for that kind of thing. But it is, I think we're in real trouble when it comes to not sharing basic truths and basic reality. It was Kellyanne Conway early in the Trump administration, very early, who said that she referred to something called alternative facts. I think she was talking to Chuck Todd. Well,
yes, that's right.
Well, Chuck, you may say that there weren't as many people at the inauguration as Sean Spicer says, but these are alternative facts. So, there really aren't such things as alternative facts, but we do seem to have at least two sets of them these days. And that is a problem that worries me a lot. And I do think that news literacy can be a part of it. I was heartened to see former President Obama speak about the News Literacy Project. That was interesting and made my friend Alan Miller, who's the founder of that, very, very happy. And that, I think, is a piece of it. And, you know, we have to, those of us who believe in factuality and truth have to keep going and do our best to make sure that people at least have access to the truth. And, you know, fact checking is not entirely effective, but it's an important piece of the puzzle. So it's a very tricky problem and a very troubling problem.
Margaret, I would just add, you know, while you're right that there are functioning newspapers in lots of big cities, there are still thousands of news deserts, and they're growing, every day. And
Yes.
and while we don't worry quite so much about the big cities, where there are also all sorts of vibrant new ecosystems developing in lots of the big cities, we still have many counties in the country that have absolutely no local news source, and that is very, very troubling.
Absolutely. And some of those news deserts exist in places that used to have the sort of widespread coverage from a regional newspaper.
Absolutely. Right.
You know, and I mean, there's one, I always think about Buffalo because I spent so much time here, and some of my reporting from the book comes from Buffalo, but there's a news desert, so identified by Penny Muse Abernathy, who's now, I'm happy to see, at my alma mater at Medill. Orleans County, which is not too far from Rochester and Buffalo, is a news desert, according to her definition. It used to have coverage from the Buffalo News and the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle, but they've kind of pulled in their circulation area. So, that is, and of course, Chicago is a very interesting situation now with Alden Global Capital owning the Tribune, with WBEZ joining forces with the Sun-Times, the beleaguered Sun-Times. It's fascinating, and it's both fascinating and troubling.
Right. Both indeed.
Yeah, if I could just add a point on that as well. And you definitely see these deserts everywhere, but there are certain places where there are some signs of optimism. So another course that I teach is called Media Law and Government Transparency Practicum, in which we train both law students and journalism students on how to use freedom of information laws. And then we place them at various externships. And there's a lot of these journalism nonprofits which are blossoming all over the country. There's some really incredible ones. There's one called Cicero Independiente, which is servicing communities, Hispanic communities that have never gotten attention from mainstream media. And so they're looking at suburban communities outside of Chicago. So there are some little signs of growth and so forth, but clearly nothing to address the issues that Charles has raised, and Margaret, you as well, in terms of the real larger picture of the news deserts that we now are experiencing.
And to Charles's point, just to plug Medill, the local news initiative at Medill is looking at a lot of data to try and figure out how to revive a subscription model that will replace with digital news or other news some of that lost from local news. And then to Margaret's point, I remember the Post covering 30,000 plus lies during the former administration. And I remember watching Scott Pelley at CBS at the beginning of the Trump years, just trying to cover the news. And he'd have to begin every CBS evening news with a couple minutes of, here's what was said, and then here are the facts about what actually is, which was a whole new element that I, was just like living in Alice in Wonderland. But it was illustrative of the struggle we all have. Doreen, back to you from the local to the global. You've worked with the Buffett Institute on Global Affairs here on some of these issues, and your research interests are international press freedom and global developments in media law and policy. What lessons can be learned from other countries, good or bad, about threats to press freedom through that lens?
Well, one thing is that there's a lot happening that's not good news in various parts of the world. Certainly, I saw it when I was in Hong Kong. So, not just poor Hong Kong, which mentioned because they had this, as I mentioned earlier, this incredible, robust media ecosystem. And then there were these massive pro-democracy protests in 2018, 2019, where upwards of 1 million people were marching in the streets. And so China forced Hong Kong to impose a national security law, which is a trend that's happening all over the world, an introduction of national security laws, anti-terrorism, official secrets acts, and so on. And certainly we saw it throughout Southeast Asia, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Philippines, Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, you name it, it's there. But at the same time, there are efforts to try to address some of these issues. And going to Nicholas's point about is the US ready to impose any regulations on the internet and on tech platforms, the US is not in any advanced stage, but Europe definitely is, and they are about to introduce a new bill, a Digital Security Act, which will impose exactly these types of obligations on the part of tech platforms to regulate what's on there, to regulate fake news and so forth. But it's gone back actually 20 years, particularly involving data protection, like protecting the privacy there. So it's happening in Europe, and it's happening in other parts of the world. In terms of where some of this damage is, again, just echoing some of my fellow panelists about the strong words that Donald Trump used during his presidency. He did not invent the phrase, fake news. He did not invent the phrase enemy of the people, but what he said had a direct impact on authoritarian countries around the world who took solace in two ways. One, that the US wasn't going to go after them and criticize them for human rights abuses, but two, they began to echo his very words, whether it was the Philippines President Duterte saying exactly the same words and dubbing people enemy of the people, or whether or not it was even China who said, see, Trump is right. We've always said it's fake news is really a true problem, and that's why democracies can't happen here. And so that, I think, is some of the biggest concerns, that the US still has an outsized role in its impact in the rest of the world, yet the rest of the world is moving on as well.
Now let me address the elephant in the room, and I'll come back to Charles with a question we all must consider. Charles, as a dean and a teacher, how much of the threat to press freedom is on us? And by that, I mean how much of media ourselves, members of our own profession, or cable news and social media damaged our own reputation and credibility? Do we share some of the blame?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the chase for ratings and eyeballs and clicks has certainly been damaging. And I understand the business model was based on that. So there was self-interest in chasing those dollars, if you will. But we also, again, have done a very poor job. We assume, as sort of Nick suggested, that people understand the difference between free press and free speech. We assume that people, when they are combing through pages or scrolling through pages, that they are being discerning readers. We think there is no harm in sort of some of the blithe reporting that we do, the horse race reporting that we do, rather than real trenchant analysis, because that's, again, what draws eyeballs. And so we have been hoisted on our own petard in some instance in the way that we have treated this information, and not I get that the public will oftentimes reject the most serious news. And as my boss, John Johnson, used to say, you do have to mix the orange juice with the castor oil. But I think in many instances, we have, in commercializing the news and commoditizing as much as we have really done a poor job of living up to our mission of educating the public and making them informed. We've spent much more time entertaining them. So.
Agreed. The infotainment shows. Nick, to ask this another way, is the threat to press freedom less in some ways about the rise of partisan media and more about the damage to press freedom wrought by the collapse of the old business model? I know you've written about that for newspapers and local news. You had a thoughtful piece in the New York Review of Books 2 years ago and talked about the whole history and sweep of the business model for news and about possible solutions. Any thoughts on those?
Well, all this is related to some extent, and speaking as a person who's inclined to be an economic determinist, none of us on this screen is still in the first bloom of youth. So some of us are old enough to remember when we started in the business, and you kind of assumed that the kind of publications that we were working for were immensely profitable. They were kind of standard issue mainstream media publications. And I personally will say, I didn't ask myself, well, am I sure? How are they so profitable? Well, I think the main reason was, or a main reason was, they were mainly supported by advertising, the sort of quality press in the United States. And we now see in retrospect that they were offering quite a bad deal to advertisers, that advertisers felt they had no choice but to accept. So it was a kind of false spring, the prosperity of the press. And what these platforms did was they found a way to come to advertisers and say, we can offer you a much, much, much better deal. I mean, it's a tiny example, but Margaret mentioned I'm directing a small publishing company. And, so we take out advertising. And it is, I mean, if we take out an ad for Margaret's book in the New York Times Book Review, it'd be like $5,000 or more. If we took out a whole ad campaign on Facebook, it would be like $35. So, so the advertising, left especially print media in en masse and migrated to the platforms. And the platforms are not, the print media were selling curated content that was, more or less true most of the time. And the platforms were saying, we're a common carrier, we're just a place where anybody can say anything. And they've been pitched many times over the years to invest in newsrooms and have decided not to. They say, that's not our business, we don't make content. So it's a kind of experiment in a way of saying, if you say to advertisers, where would you rather be? A place that publishes actual, true, reliable content most of the time, or a place that will charge you a lot less and offer you a lot more efficiency and is utterly unreliable, they choose B. We saw that happen. So that's kind of the heart of the problem, at least in US media.
Digital actually is very reliable for digital advertisers, because I know when you clicked, where you went, how much time you spent. There's so much information that I'm gathering from you. We sold them a bill of goods in the old days. We said, oh, the halo effect of our content will actually rub off on you, and they'll buy. And they didn't know that for sure. Sure, we tried to do lots of surveys to convince them of that, but they were not very effective. Digital gives them a very, very precise measure of the engagement that people have with those messages that we never.
You sound like a man who's bought advertising from Medill.
You think? Yeah.
It does change your perspective.
Absolutely.
I remember the Tribune used to charge something like $125,000 to $150,000 for a full page ad in the front
page. Yeah.
I mean, an outrageous amount. Nick, just to follow up a little bit, one of the things in your article that I remember was talking about government subsidies, rich buyers, philanthropy-based, and sort of the dangers, how the old school among us look at that, like, God, no, the government shouldn't be subsidizing us. Do we have a choice at this point if we want to survive?
Well, the way I would frame it is any possible way of funding journalism has a potential downside. The old way of, like, the rich media barons who funded Medill and Columbia J School was the equivalent of chasing clicks. But in those days, it was promoting this Spanish-American War and stuff like that. So that's one form of corruption. Advertising has another set of corruptions. Rich owners who are supposed to be sort of Medici-like patrons, have another set of problems, including that they can lose interest. And so I would say about government funding, there's a lot of ways to do government funding, and it shouldn't be dismissed out of hand the way journalists tend to do. And instead, the conversation should be, are there ways to structure it that capture some of the upside and reduce some of the downside? What really changed my thinking on this was living in a big research university. Columbia gets something like $1 billion a year from the federal government to do research. Essentially, all the research showing that climate change is real has been funded by the federal government during an era when it was dominated by the Republican Party. So how did that happen? Let's look at that, you know? So it just shows there are ways to build systems to make them more or less immune to interference by interested parties. And I think that is an option that should be on the table.
The NIH and the CDC do have that independence. That's how they could.
Yeah, I mean, if you talk to scientists, they say, oh, it's terrible out here. You know, you've never seen such a nightmare. Well, it doesn't look like that to me. So, yeah, I mean, they have a degree of independence. They have peer review systems. They don't allow an individual Congress member to rule on every grant. You know, they're insulated in that way. They make multi-year commitments, et cetera. I don't want to say it's a perfect system, but I do want to say there's lots of ways to structure government support. And by the way, you know, certainly if an economist were on the screen, they would say, you know, the nonprofit news sector that we've been praising is in fact a government subsidy system because it's a tax subsidy.
Right.
So that's an example. And that system isn't perfect either, but I think all options should be considered instead of some being automatically rejected as unthinkable.
Excellent. And Margaret, covering the media as you do, as well as your former time as public editor and ombudswoman, how bad or lasting is the damage to our reputation and credibility when politicians attack us as being fake or biased as never before? And what can we kind of do as journalists to model better behavior, if you will?
Well, that is something I have seen change a lot over my, decades in journalism. I think I used to feel as though most people, of course, the press always had its enemies and critics, absolutely. But these days, it's not unusual for a local TV crew to go out to cover a school board meeting and be harassed and be called fake news and be driven out. That is something pretty new, I think, in the United States. And I find it, really worrisome. I've also seen it happen when, when a newspaper or other journalistic organization does a big investigative piece that the objects of it will default to sort of, that's, to disparaging the news organization. I do think it's very damaging. I mean, it's anecdotal, but I've had so many people that I've interviewed. I mean, I try to talk to people all the time about their news sources and what they think about the news media. And, people will make these they think that they're being funny. But they'll say, I'll say, well, I write for the Washington Post, and I'll get back, oh, so fake news, right? It's not unusual, and there's a real edge to it. So I think that it is something that has happened, and it's going to be hard to, kind of reinsert the toothpaste. I don't know really, I don't know what to do about that. I don't know that a big, all industry ad campaign would be very effective. It's a really troubling, troubling development. And I think it does do lasting harm.
I do too. And to Doreen's point, it's migrated abroad in ways over the last 5 years and before. Doreen, do you see the damage from authoritarian regimes, sort of as you picking up on what you said before about adopting Trump's terms in some cases, getting worse and more confident in their attacks on journalism, and that continuing to hurt our credibility abroad as journalists?
Well, yeah, and picking up on points made by Nick and Margaret. So with Margaret, saying that it feels anecdotal that the media here and journalists are being attacked. U.S. Press Freedom Tracker actually documents how many assaults are done against journalists, and I think it was something like over 400 last year, and many of them not from governments, not from being wrongfully arrested, but by citizens on the street. And I think that this is a phenomenon, all over the world. And part of the issue is, as Nick pointed out, there are fewer and fewer democracies. So there was a period of time in the late 90s and the early noughts where there was an increase in democracies. But what did they find out? With democracies come press freedom and criticism. And so there's been, additional crackdowns on this. And then there are no repercussions for some of these actions. So case in point with Russia. And so they started this war. They're suppressing not only just horrific, war crimes and how many people they're killing, but of course abuses against journalists and all these various human rights violations. And so they are on the UN Human Rights Council. They did get kicked off of that. But everyone forgets that they're also on the UN Security Council. They're one of 5 permanent countries, US, UK, France, China, and Russia. And they vetoed in early March this resolution to have a ceasefire, right, which is the power of the Security Council. And there's nothing they can do to kick them out. Last week, there was some discussion, well, we'll make them justify their vetoes, but in the end, there's no mechanism designed to have repercussions and these type of sanctions. So you're hoping that economic sanctions will work. But with the resolve of President Putin, that could go on for the foreseeable future. And then in situations like what happened with Saudi Arabia and its targeted killing of the Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi back in 2018, the UN Special Rapporteur for Arbitrary Killings, Agnes Callamard, who's long served at Columbia in their Global Freedom of Expression project, was able to document quite convincingly in a fearless report to the UN about the involvement of Saudi Arabia and Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and nothing happened. And even after President Biden took office, again, even though the US documented that it agreed with these reports and so on, also no sanctions against Saudi Arabia. So until there is some kind of repercussions on the part of these autocrats, I don't foresee, I hate to say it, much changes in the current situation.
Okay, thank you for that. Now we have about 5 minutes left. I'm mindful of our time. And I just want to do around the table quickly, a lightning round with each of you on solutions. Going forward, what might we do? Some of you have already spoken about these, but Charles, to start with you, to plug my friend Jim Warren, who's the executive director of NewsGuard. What about these sites that check for bias and balance and actually rate news organizations? What do you think of those as a solution, or others?
I think it's a measure that can certainly help. I think, much as Nick was suggesting with the economic models, I don't think there's one solution. I think this is going to take a multi-pronged approach. Yes, I think some fact checking will help. I think, again, some news literacy will help. I do think, Margaret, some sort of, well, a campaign reminding people of the importance of the press may not have tremendous impact, but I think we have to be out there talking about more than the loss of journalism jobs in news deserts. We have to actually be talking about the real impact that this is having on society and democracy. We just have to, shout that as loud and as often as we can.
Yep. And Nick, the impact of the Nobel Peace Prize awarded last year to Maria Ressa in the Philippines and Russia's Dmitry Muratov, a year later, she's facing multiple lawsuits, and he just had to leave. He was one of the last independent media to leave Russia. Did it make a difference, or can it contribute, that kind of focus on their courage?
Well, I mean, I hate to be disrespectful or facile, but it's like those old jokes about chicken soup, can't hurt. But I think ultimately, globally, you need structures around journalism that are really thought through. And we journalists are not trained very well to think in those terms, but I think we have to start thinking in those terms. And that's, economic structures, legal structures. To use a sports analogy, what the field looks like, what the rules of the game are, shapes who the stars are, but you don't notice the rules and the shape of the field, you notice the stars. So I hope that we journalists will come together globally and have a really serious ongoing discussion about those kinds of issues.
I do too. And quickly to Margaret, last thoughts on what we can do externally or internally to police ourselves.
Well, I agree with what Charles and Nick have said, and I won't repeat those things, though I think they're right, and I agree. I would just add that I'd like to see the measures that are being considered to shore up local news get the support that I think is actually is possible. And some of them are tax incentives. There's a whole range of things. And I'd like to see them get support because they can help slow the demise of local news, which is so important in this whole picture.
Excellent. And Doreen, solutions in law and ethics that media can learn from about how to protect themselves?
Yeah, so contrary to all my other comments, I am optimistic on some aspects. And that is that there's continued support for organizations that provide legal support. So Committee to Protect Journalists, they will talk to officials at various governments if someone is detained. They do provide some emergency funding, but there's organizations like the Media Defense Organization, which is based in London. They were founded in 2008, and they actually provide lawyers for jail journalists. They actually do capacity building and train existing lawyers on how to better represent journalists. And they also do strategic litigation, which in the international human rights infrastructure actually has had an impact, where they take on strategic litigation in criminal defamation cases in Africa, for example, and a major decision that said that it was wrong for this one particular Western African country to imprison a journalist for writing about corruption in government, and that they had to take away the criminal penalties, had a ripple effect throughout Africa because that court ordered that country and others to follow this type of standard. So I do think that if there's more support for strategic litigation for organizations like this, Access Now does digital rights litigation and so on, that could help somewhat, not ameliorate the problem, but give more sustenance to individual cases and hopefully systemically as well.
Excellent. Okay, that's all our time. I hope all our students get to see this at some point. I want to thank our foreign press colleagues for joining, and especially our panel for their wise insights. We have a challenging road ahead, but I feel better having heard your perspectives on it all. Thank you all, and courage to all on Press Freedom Day.